19th century United States. In the silence of the night, a young enslaved felt the marks of the whip burning his skin. His body had been marked by iron, his trampled dignity, his denied humanity. But inside it, something has never been broken: the desire to be free. This young man was Frederick Douglass, who was born enslaved, suffered humiliations, whip, and hunger, but turned all pain into strength. Over time, not only conquered his own freedom, but also rose before the world as one of the most powerful voices against slavery. His testimony, his writing, and his fiery speeches echoed throughout America and beyond, inspiring the struggle for abolition and equality. Frederick Douglass's trajectory shows that even in the darkness of slavery, it was possible to forge an unbreakable spirit. Stories like Douglass reveal that even pain can become a weapon against injustice. If you believe that this giant's memory needs to be preserved, subscribe to the channel and answer in the comments. For you, what has the most power? The strength of a body in rebellion or the force of a free word? The muffled smell of sweat and damp earth mingled with the bittersweet stench of the old straw that lined the Senzala floor. The sound of the whips cutting the air and the muffled lament of the exhausted workers were part of the scenario that received the little Frederick Washington Bailey as he opened his eyes every morning. The weak light of the dawn was filtered through the cracks of the wooden walls, projecting dancing shadows on the floor, as if the ghosts of those who lived there before watching the dreams of those who were still trapped. From an early age, Frederick learned that freedom was a strange word, a distant concept that existed only in the nightclubs of the elders. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was an ethereal figure in her life. Working on a distant plantation, Frederick's mother made stealing visits to her son, walking miles at night to pack him in her arms, tired by work. His presence was ephemeral, wrapped in tenderness and grief. The boy missed him, as if it were a part of himself that had been torn him up. Each meeting was a gift he kept in his memory like a treasure. The maternal absence was filled by Betsy Bailey, his grandmother, a woman with calloused hands and looking severe, but warmed Frederick's heart with old stories and lullabies. Betsy, with his ancestral wisdom, kept alive the flame of hope in the children he took, showing them that, despite the currents, human dignity could not be broken. Life on Edward Lloyd's farm was an incessant cycle of toil and submission. Frederick, still small, witnessed scenes of brutality that would mark him forever. The screams of the whips tearing the unprepared flesh of their fellow masters echoed by the plantation, and the pain reverberated in their own bones, even without being directly hit. It was a cruel lesson that his skin, his color, determined his destiny. The young Frederick, however, had insatiable curiosity and a silent resistance. He watched everything carefully, from the gestures of the forefront to the tired expressions of workers, assimilating information like a sponge. In the rare moments of relief, he heard with fascination the stories told by the older slaves on distant lands and the freedom that had once been stolen from them. At age 6, Frederick was sent to Baltimore, a vibrant and contrast city, to serve at the house of Hugh Auld, brother of his owner's son, in law. Baltimore represented a drastic change in his life. The streets were populated by a mixture of freedom and oppression, and Frederick felt the city's pulse as almost tangible. It was there that he began to understand the power of words. Sophia Auld, Hugh's wife, initially treated Frederick with a kindness he had never known, starting to teach him to read the alphabet. However, this spark of hope was quickly erased by Hugh Auld, who stated that education would make Frederick inappropriate to slavery, a threat to the order he so rigidly maintained. The prohibition only fueled Frederick's desire for knowledge. He decided that at any cost he would learn to read and write, believing that education was the way to freedom. He eagerly observed the white children around him, exchanging pieces of bread for reading lessons, and absorbed each word as if it were the key to opening the currents that held him. Childhood in the chains was a time of loneliness and discovery for Frederick Douglass. He grew up with the pain of a destination he had not chosen, but also with the determination of sculpting his own way. Amid the darkness of oppression, he nourished an inner flame, a silent promise that one day the chains would be broken. This promise SSA would be the foundation of his future struggle for freedom and equality, a battle he would crash with sharp words and a voice that would echo through the ages. The sun was ruthless on the plantation. Each radius looked like a sharp blade on Frederick Douglass's mistreated skin. The land, dry and infertile, reflected the scorching heat, making the air dense and suffocating. Frederick felt the weight of the hoe in his calloused hands. Each movement ripped droplets of sweat and blood from his strenuous body. He was just a young boy, but his body was already carrying marks of a lifetime of suffering. The forefront, with their healthy expressions, observed the slaves with vulture eyes, always ready to attack the slightest sign of weakness or rebellion. Frederick, even young, knew that any slip could cost her dearly. He had learned to swallow his screams and tears, turning pain into a mask of impassibility. But within you, a volcano of revolt boiled incessantly. It was in one of these suffocating mornings that Frederick first felt the bitter taste of hot iron on his skin. The foreman, a corpulent man named Thomas, was pleased to mark the slaves he considered insubordinated. Frederick, in a gesture of tiredness, had dropped the hoe. Thomas's reaction was immediate and brutal. Frederick was dragged through the rough floor, his skin tearing in contact with the stones. The world around him has become a blur with indifferent faces and muffled screams. Hot iron pain piercing its meat was indescribable. The nauseating smell of burnt flesh filled the air, mingling with the smell of sweat and earth. Frederick bit his lips so hard that he felt the metallic taste of his own blood. He knew he couldn't scream, that he couldn't give Thomas the satisfaction of seeing his agony. Instead, he closed his eyes and focused on the image of his mother, the promise of freedom she had whispered in her ear so many times. The following days were a whirlwind of pain and fever. Frederick was struggling to keep conscious. His body was on fire. The mark on his skin pulsed like a living wound. He knew he couldn't afford to get sick. The plantation did not stop, and any sign of weakness could mean death. But the pain was a constant companion, a cruel reminder of his condition. However, even in the midst of this storm, Frederick found strength to resist. He knew his body could be chained, but his mind was free. In times of stillness, he took refuge in the books he could smuggle, in the words he learned to read with suffering. Each letter, each sentence was a brick in the construction of its freedom. Frederick also found comfort in the silent solidarity of other slaves. There was an invisible force that united them, a mutual understanding that shared pain made them stronger. Frederick absorbed every account, every story told in the shadow of the trees, where the vigilant eyes of the forefront could not reach them. One night, as he lay on the cold floor of the senzala, Frederick realized that the brand on his skin was not just a symbol of his pain. It was a constant reminder of his resilience, proof that he had survived. And with each scar, with every memory of humiliation, Frederick's determination was strengthened. He knew that one day these marks would be seen not as signs of submission, but as medals of his struggle for freedom. This was the foundation of his resistance. Frederick Douglass, the young slave marked by pain, would become the liberty speaker, and the scars in his body would be witnesses of his indomitable courage, from his slave journey to the icon of the struggle against oppression. The pain that the oppressors inflicted would be the same that would feed their indomitable spirit, forging a voice that would echo through history, crying out for justice and equality. The city of Baltimore was a quilt of hits of contrasts, where freedom circulated in the paved streets, but the shadow of oppression still hung over the homes of slaves. Frederick Douglass, even in his youth, felt this duality pulse around him, a tension that instigated and worked out. He knew that in order to transcend the currents that held him, he needed to master the words, those same words that were used against him, but could one day free him. Auld's house seemed to be, at first glance, a comfortable refuge compared to the brutality of the plantation. But Frederick soon realized that the invisible currents of ignorance were equally oppressive. Sophia Auld at first was a ray of sunshine in her life. She treated him with an unexpected kindness, teaching him to recognize the letters and pronounce the words, as if sowing seeds of hope in arid soil. Frederick remembered the soft sound of her voice, each letter intertwined in his ear as a song of freedom that he barely began to understand. However, Sophia's kindness was quickly repressed by her husband, Hugh Auld, who understood the transforming power of education. He warned his wife, with a severity that reverberated around the house as a distant thunder, that teaching a slave to read was to make him inappropriate for servitude. Frederick listened to these words with the clarity of a church bell at noon, each syllable closed into his mind like a dagger. For Hugh, literacy was a dangerous port for a slave mind, an idea that he could not tolerate. The prohibition only served to ignite Frederick's determination. He understood that the words were the tools with which he could sculpt his own freedom. Thus, he began his clandestine journey in search of knowledge. He became a spy in his own life, capturing pieces of conversations, observing the movements of the lips of those who passed, each syllable absorbed with the greed of a hungry. In the streets of Baltimore, Frederick found his first allies in the form of white children. He exchanged pieces of bread for reading lessons, every crumb of food converted into letters he kept in memory as precious relics. Children, unconscious of the impact of their lessons, became Frederick's first teachers, the initial steps in their long march to freedom. With each word learned, Frederick was closer to breaking the currents that imprisoned him. He devoured old newspapers, discarded leaflets, and any printed material he found. The lyrics danced before their tired eyes, becoming images of freedom and justice in his mind. He read about places where men were judged for their actions and not by the color of their skin, and about people who rose against oppression, their voices echoing through time as trumpets of revolution. Frederick also began writing. His hands, although heated by the servitude's tools, found a new strength by holding a feather. He practiced on any available surface, scribbling letters on the ground dust or wooden walls. Each letter was a gesture of rebellion, each word a brick in the construction of its own freedom. He wrote about his pain and hopes, about the future he wanted to achieve. His words formed bridges between the painful present and the dreamed future. But the path of knowledge was dangerous. Frederick knew that if discovered, he would face severe punishments. Old's surveillance was constant, and the city was full of eyes that could betray it. He lived in a constant warning state. Every shadow or passing behind him could mean the end of his search. The idea of giving up was unbearable. The flame of knowledge had already been lit in his soul, and he was determined to turn it into a conflagration that would burn the chains of his slavery. Frederick Douglass's thirst for knowledge was an act of resistance in itself. He knew that every word learned, every idea understood, was a weapon against oppression, a tool to sculpt his own freedom. He understood that true freedom began in the mind, and that even if his body was chained, his mind could be as free as he dared to allow. Thus, Frederick continued his lonely journey, his unshakable determination. He knew that the way to freedom would be long and hard, but was willing to pay the price. Each day he came closer to his goal, the words becoming steps that would lead him out of the abyss of slavery and the light of freedom. Frederick Douglass, the young slave who dared to learn to read and write, was becoming the man who would speak for freedom, his voice resonating through the times as a lighthouse of hope and resistance. The oppressive heat of noon involved Frederick Douglass as a suffocating cloak as he worked in the fields. The sun seemed to mock his misery, reflecting on his sweaty skin and burning every exposed inch. That day, however, something was different. Anger was seething inside him, a force that threatened to overflow. He was tired of submitting to the brutality of the overseers, tired of seeing his brothers and sisters of color being treated as less than human beings. He could feel the tension in the air, as if the earth under his feet were about to explode. Thomas Covey, the cruel overseer of the plantation, was a man known for his sadistic pleasure in inflicting pain. He walked among the slaves with an arrogant posture. His presence was enough for fear to spread like an uncontrolled fire. Covey had small, cruel eyes that shone with a wicked light whenever he found a new victim to torment. That day, he approached Frederick. The whip in his hand was an extension of his volontade malevola. Frederick knew what was coming. He had experienced Covey's cruelty before, but something inside him refused to bend again. When Covey raised the whip, Frederick felt a rebellion flame light herself inside. With a quick and unexpected movement, he grabbed the whip before he hit him, the rough leather cutting his palm. But the pain was ignored for a moment of pure determination. He looked into Covey's eyes, and for the first time, the overseer saw something he had never expected: resistance. The following struggle was fierce and desperate. Frederick, in an act of courage that surprised himself, faced Covey with all his strength. Every blow he drew was fed by years of repressed pain, each punch a statement that he would no longer be a silent victim. The sound of the two bodies crashed into the fields, a cacophony of shouts and panting breaths. The other slaves stopped their work, their eyes wide with astonishment and hope. They knew Frederick was risking everything, that their rebellion could cost her life. But in each face there was a trace of admiration, a spark of inspiration that lit up to see one of them rise against the oppressor. Frederick was not just fighting for himself, he was fighting for them all, for every person who had already suffered under the merciless yoke of slavery. Covey, caught by surprise by Frederick's ferocity, retreated, his confidence shaken. He did not expect such resistance from a slave, someone he considered inferior. Frederick, on the other hand, was imbued with a force I had never experienced before. It was as if every blow he broke out, not only the physical currents, but also the invisible currents that had kept him captive for so long. The fight ended with Covey lying on the floor, his shattered arrogance, his body marked by battle. Frederick, breathing with difficulty, felt a wave of relief and triumph. He had won, not only physically, but also morally. Covey, humiliated, did not dare to lift the whip again against Frederick. From that day, Frederick was no longer touched by him. Frederick's victory over Covey was more than a simple physical victory. It was a symbol of resistance, proof that slaves could fight for their freedom, which were not just passive victims of their destiny. Frederick's courage echoed for the plantation, his bravery inspiring others to question his own submission. He became a legend among his peers, a headlight of hope in a world of darkness. Frederick Douglass, with his indomitable courage, showed that submission was not the only choice. He had broken the currents of oppression with his own hands, proving that human dignity could never be completely crushed. And this victory, although small on scale, was a crucial step on his journey to freedom. Frederick Douglass's courage on that day would resonate through the ages, a testimony that the human willpower can overcome the most overwhelming adversities, an echo that even in the darker circumstances, rebellion and courage are possible. The night was wrapped in a cloak of silent darkness, only interrupted by the distant murmur while Frederick Douglass, with his heart fired, sneaked through the shadows of the plantation. The air was impregnated with the smell of moist earth and rotting leaves, and each sound seemed amplified by the tension that impregnated it. The pale and indifferent moon thrown his rays on the tortuous path he would have to walk. Frederick knew that night was not like the others. It was the night he would bet everything in search of freedom. The plan was simple in its essence, but complex in its execution. He knew that the escape was a delicate dance between courage and despair, where a single false step could cost his life. Each movement had to be calculated, each decision measured with the accuracy of an artisan. Frederick was aware that the smallest of the noises could attract the attention of the forefront, and that the discovery would mean a brutal punishment, or worse, execution. With Covey's image fallen in his past, Frederick was driven by a new determination. The victory over the overseer had lit an incandescent flame in his heart, not just a thirst for freedom, but a hunger to live. He was no longer willing to accept a destination imposed on him by others. The words he had learned, the stories he had heard, and the strength he had discovered within himself weaved a tapestry of hope and resistance together. He had allies, those who, even in silence, shared their desire for freedom. Anna Murray, a free woman with whom Frederick has a deep and unshakable love, played a crucial role in her escape. She provided him with sailor clothes and some money, believing in the promise of a shared future, where the chains of slavery could no longer separate them. Anna was the anchor of hope that kept Frederick firm in her decision. Her love was a lighthouse guiding him through darkness. The trip to the north was long and threatening, a journey full of danger and uncertainties. Frederick embarked on a train. Each crawl of the wheels on the rails was a reminder of the fragility of his disguise. He kept his eyes low, hiding the recognition of other passengers in the details of the landscape that passed quickly across the window. Each stop was a wave of silent panic, the constant fear of being discovered and dragged back to the chains he had left behind. At one point, he had to use sailor documents that were not his own, a skilled falsification that allowed him to pass a free man. Adrenaline ran through his veins with each encounter with the guards. His eyes searched Frederick's features for some sign of fraud. But luck, or perhaps providence, was by her side. Each control surpassed was a barrier. Each kilometer traveled a silent victory. The city of New York, when finally reached it, was a sea of unknown faces, a maze of imposing streets and buildings. Frederick was stunned by the city's freedom, but aware that true security was yet to come. He headed for New Bedford, Massachusetts, where the promise of a new life was waiting for him. There he could mix with free men and find a community willing to welcome him. The arrival in New Bedford was a rebirth. Frederick, in a symbolic act of liberation, decided to adopt a new name, Anaglas, inspired by a poem he had read during his clandestine lessons. He knew that with this new name, he left the slave identity behind and embraced the free man he had always knew to be. It was a new identity for a new chapter of his life, a name that would be proudly carrying until the end of his days. But freedom was not the end of his journey, but the beginning of a new mission. Frederick Douglass, now a free man, knew that his fight was just beginning. The scars of his past were resistance marks, and he was determined to use his voice to fight the injustices he had known so closely. He joined the abolitionist movement, his eloquence and passion gaining hearts and minds wherever he went. In his lectures, Douglass spoke with a force that came from the depths of his soul. His words were like sharp blades that cut the lies of oppression. He told his story with vivid details. Every memory of pain and resistance formed a vivid picture of the atrocities of slavery. People listened, and their consciences were aroused by the power of their narrative. Frederick Douglass, who escaped from the shadows of the night to the light of freedom, became a giant in the struggle for justice and equality. His way was full of challenges, but he had proved that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. With each speech, with every written word, he continued to fight, not only for himself, but for all those who were still chained. And so, the escape to freedom marked the beginning of a new era, not just Douglas, but for an entire country that was beginning to awaken for the promise of freedom and equality for all. The wind blew firmly against the linen curtains of the small house in Rochester, where Frederick Douglass, now a free man, sat on his desk. The penalty in his hand danced on the paper, staining him with the paint that drained from his deepest and most painful memories. It was the year 1845, and the world was about to know the story of a man born in chains, but who had refused to be defined by them. The smell of paper and ink filled the air, mixing with the scent of coffee by cooling beside, a luxury that he could now enjoy in his condition as a free man. The narrative he wrote was not just an account of his life. It was a war against oppression, a witness to the brutality of slavery, and a tribute to human resilience. On each page, Douglass described the horrors he had witnessed, the scars he carried not only in his body but in his soul. He spoke of the dark nights in the Senzala, the screams that echoed through the fields, the hot iron that had marked his skin, and the steel of the determination that shaped his spirit. The publication of Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, was a watershed, not just for Douglass, but for an entire nation that was beginning to awaken to the injustices of slavery. The book was received with amazement and reverence, his words resonating like thunder through consciousness sleepily. With each copy sold, with each page turned, the brutal reality of slavery became impossible to ignore. Douglass, now not just a writer, but a renowned speaker, used his voice like a weapon against oppression. He had traveled all over the country, his lectures attracting crowds who clustered to hear his words. In each speech, his voice was a flame that burned the imagination and indignation of the listeners. He spoke with an eloquence that came from the depths of his experience, each word chosen with surgical precision to cut through the lies of society. The halls where Douglass spoke were filled with almost palpable tension, as if the air itself was loaded with the electricity of his words. He described the scars into his body, the screams of his brothers and sisters in color, and the desperate hope that kept lit the flames of resistance. People often heard in silence, tears dripping over before indifferent faces. In each face, he saw the possibility of change, of a future where freedom was not a privilege, but an inalienable right. Douglass was not limited to spoken words. He wrote inflamed articles for the abolitionist newspaper, The North Star, which had founded with his own hands. Each edition was a paper bullet, triggered against the balavers of slavery, a call to weapons to all those who believed in equality. He used the newspaper as a platform to amplify the voices of the oppressed, to tell stories that would otherwise remain silenced. But even with his growing fame, Douglass faced constant threats. There were those who feared the power of their words, who wanted to silence it at any cost. He knew his life was at risk, but the idea of retreating was inconceivable. For Douglass, each threat was a confirmation that his words were impacting, that he was shaking the foundations of an unfair society. Douglass's impact was not restricted to U.S. territory. His voice echoed beyond, reaching Europe, where he was received as a hero. In cities like London and Dublin, their lectures attracted sedental crowds for justice. He found allies among European abolitionists, who saw in Douglass an emblematic figure of the struggle for freedom. The warm welcome he received abroad was a balm to his tired soul, a recognition that his fight was not in vain. Frederick Douglass's legacy as a speaker and writer transcended his own time. His words, such as seeds planted on fertile ground, germinated in social justice movements that flourished in the following decades. He inspired generations of activists, his courage serving as a lighthouse for those who faced the darkness of oppression. Looking at the horizon of his life, Douglass knew that his mission was far from completed. He would continue to fight, not only for the freedom of the oppressed, but for the dignity of all humanity. His name has become synonymous with resistance and hope, a reminder that even in the darker circumstances, a man's voice can be powerful enough to change the world. And so, Frederick Douglass, the man who began his life in chains, became a giant whose voice would echo for the centuries, crying out for justice, equality, and freedom for all. The cold wind cut the streets of Boston, like invisible blades that were insinuated by the cracks in Frederick Douglass's clothes. He walked with determination on the sidewalks wet by the recent rain, each step echoing the weight of his mission. The year was 1848, and Douglass, now a renowned speaker and writer, was about to participate in an event that would mark a new chapter in his already extraordinary journey. The acre smell of burnt charcoal hovered in the air, mixing with the sweet aroma of the roasted nuts of the street vendors, while the carriages passed hasty, splashing dirty water at the edges of the sidewalks. Within the hall where the Women's Rights Convention happened, a buzz of female voices rose in waves, mixed with the sound of nerve laughs and anxious expectations. Douglass crossed the door with a sense of reverence, recognizing the historical importance of the moment. The walls of the hall, adorned with posters and pamphlets requiring equality, seemed to vibrate with the energy of those present. The women gathered there were as a force of nature, determined to break the barriers that patriarchal society had imposed them. They were led by figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, women whose burning words had inspired Douglass to see beyond the struggle for abolition. Frederick was at home between those warriors. He knew that the struggle for freedom was not restricted to a single cause, but it was a comprehensive movement that included all the oppressed. For Douglass, freedom slaves was intrinsically linked to women's rights, and the oppression of one group strengthened the subjugation of another. He watched carefully as Stanton rose to the pulpit, his clear and authoritarian voice filling the hall, demanding that women be recognized as full citizens, entitled to vote and self-determination. Douglass felt the power of his words reverberating in his own heart, each sentence an echo of his own struggle for freedom. When it came to his turn to speak, Douglass took the stage with the same confidence that defined him, his imposing presence capturing everyone's attention. He began to speak about the intersection of struggles for abolition and women's rights, noting that justice could not be complete while half of humanity remained chained by unfair social norms. His voice, powerful as a distant thunder, echoed through the hall, every word loaded with conviction and passion. He spoke not as a man who had found his freedom, but as someone who still longed for the liberation of all who were kept captive by any form of oppression. Douglass's words were received enthusiastically, and he felt a wave of solidarity and support from those present. However, he also knew that his position was not universally accepted. There were those who believed that the struggle for women's rights should be postponed until the abolition was reached. But Douglass was convinced that the two causes were inseparable, and that true justice could only be achieved when everyone was considered equal to the eyes of law and society. That day, Douglass not only reaffirmed his commitment to the abolitionist cause, but also established himself as an unshakable ally of women's rights. He understood that freedom was a tapestry woven with the struggles of many different wires, and that it was his duty to ensure that each of these wires was strong enough to support the pressure of the forces trying to work it. At the end of his speech, the applause was deafening, resonating like thunder that promised a storm of imminent change. After the convention, Douglass continued to work tirelessly, traveling across the country, attending meetings, writing articles, and giving lectures that challenged the social norms of the time. He became a central figure in the abolitionist movement, but also an ardent defender of civil rights and gender equality. His ability to articulate the need for justice for all, regardless of race or gender, made him a lighthouse of hope in dark times. Still, Douglass faced resistance and hostility. In many places, he was attacked not only for his support for abolition, but for his defense of women's rights. He knew that the road would be long and full of obstacles, but his determination never wavered. For Frederick, the way to freedom was not a straight line, but a complex journey that required courage, compassion, and a clear view of the future that he wanted to help build. Through his actions and words, Douglass inspired a generation of activists. He showed that the struggle for freedom could not be divided. For justice, to be true, needed to be total. He continued to use his voice to illuminate the darkness of oppression, a clarion that called everyone to come together in the struggle for a fairer and more egalitarian world. Frederick Douglass's legacy as a political activist is a powerful testimony of his vision and courage. He was not content to fight only for his own freedom, but dedicated his life to ensuring that all human beings could live in dignity and equality. And so, Douglass became not only a symbol of the resistance and power of the human spirit, but also an architect of a future where freedom and equality are inalienable rights of all, a future that he helped sculpt with every word and his action. Frederick Douglass's body rested in peace, but his soul continued to reverberate through the ages as an echo of resistance and courage that would never go out. That cold day of February 1895, the heavy clouds hung over the Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, like a veil of mourning about an age that said goodbye to one of his greatest heroes. The wind whistled between the naked trees, taking with it the last prayers whispered by those who gathered to pay their final honors. The smell of wet earth mixed with the aroma of fresh flowers deposited around the tomb, a tribute to the man who had transformed the world with his words and actions. Frederick Douglass had begun his life in chains, but his death as a free and respected man was proof that the strength of the human spirit could break any scream. In his 77 years of life, Douglass had erected against the forces of oppression, armed with your intelligence and indomitable courage. He had challenged the status quo, insisting that injustice could not be tolerated and that freedom was an inalienable right of all human beings, regardless of their color or gender. Even after his death, Douglass continued to inspire. His autobiography, his lectures, his written words left an immortal legacy, a torch that went from generation to generation, illuminating the way to those who would continue to fight for justice and equality. He was remembered as a symbol of resistance, not only by the African American community, but by all who sought to overthrow the barriers of discrimination and oppression. Douglass's impact has transcended borders, his ideas reverberating through oceans and continents. In Europe, he had been acclaimed as a hero, his lectures lighting the fire of change in hearts and minds. He was a living example of the power of determination and the human ability to overcome to the most overwhelming adversities. His legacy was studied at universities, discussed in conferences, and his life became a model for activists around the world. In the decades that followed his death, the United States underwent profound transformations, many of which Douglass had anticipated and defended. The struggle for civil rights, gender equality, and social justice continued, each victory celebrated as a step further on the path he had helped to pave. Movements emerged, leaders emerged, and in every voice that cried out of change, there was a distant echo from Frederick Douglass's powerful voice. In schools and communities, young people learned about their lives, about the boy who dared to dream of freedom and the man who, with courage and resilience, shaped the future. His speeches were recited in auditoriums, his words recorded in collective memory as a constant reminder that the struggle for justice never ended. Douglass had been a visionary, and his ideas continued to guide those who sought to build a fairer and more egalitarian world. Frederick Douglass's influence lasted not only through the words he left, but also through the ideals he embodied. He believed in the human ability to change, to evolve, and to create a society where everyone could live with dignity and respect. His example has inspired leaders of later movements, from Martin Luther King Jr. to today's civil rights advocates. He was a precursor, a giant whose shoulders continued to support the hopes of a better world. Douglass's tomb became a place of pilgrimage, a sanctuary where those who sought inspiration and strength could connect with their indomitable spirit. People came from all over the world to pay their honors, to feel the presence of a man who had turned his personal struggle into a global movement. Douglass's legacy was a reminder that even in the most adverse circumstances, an individual's willingness could change the course of history. And so, Frederick Douglass, the man who began his life in chains and died as an icon of freedom and justice, continued to live through all those who fought for a better world. Its history was an ode to the resistance, courage, and infinite capacity of the human spirit to overcome adversity. His legacy was eternal, a lighthouse that illuminated the ways of justice and equality, guiding future generations in his search for a world where everyone could live free and full. Frederick Douglass was not just a man of his time. He was a man for all time, a symbol that the struggle for freedom never ends, and that justice is a dream that it is worth fighting to the end.